Well, hey all. Appreciate that introduction. I'm going to be talking about, as you can see, game audio tips and tricks for recording. So, what I want you to be able to take away is if you're interested in doing this, it's not mandatory for game audio, but if it's the approach you want to take, or at least want to try out, you have all the tools you need to get started, do those first recordings, and figure out what gear you need. So, a bit about me, I specialize in custom recordings and in performing Foley. I actually came from film before this. I was a production sound mixer, so that's recording dialogue on set, did some film design, and then meandered my way over to game audio since it's my favorite one. I love the challenges that game audio specifically brings to the table. So, as you may have heard, if you came in a bit early, I really want to merge sound design with wildlife conservation. So, a lot of my efforts go towards partnering with Earth% for sound libraries and figuring out how to work with other game developers who also care about addressing climate change, wildlife conservation, and any other pro-social behavior. And I'm also the audio director of Urban Empire, which just shipped. It's a city builder RPG in the sky, and it's a very small team. It's just a composer on the audio side, and then me doing the audio implementation and sound design. I've also done a talk with David this past year at GameSoundCon about communities. All right, so why record? Again, you don't have to record your own sounds. You can work from sound libraries. There are definitely other ways to do it. If you just want to work in synthesizers, that's another way. But there are a couple advantages if you do want to record. So, the biggest one is you have your own unique source material captured the way that you intended. So, basically, when you have props that you can use, you can do different performances with them. So, this could be different paces, how violent you shake something, things like that can make a big difference. And having the ability to do that even before you process can reduce the amount of processing you need. And again, just give you more control over the final product. So, also, if you have your own source recordings, you can start to build your own sound library that you can pull from. So, these are going to be sounds that no one else has. Maybe no one else has a broken laundry machine that just sounds that very specific way. So being able to capture what you hear in the world that's surprising is another big part. So this could be in your home, or it could be when you're going outside, things like that. Another part is voice work. So I think mouth sounds are really underrated. If you've ever seen someone do kind of beatboxing or their own dub electro kind of thing, there's so much we can do with their own voice. There's also someone who works with Hayao Miyazaki who only does mouth sounds. Like he makes the wind in those films and everything just with his mouth. So if you want to get good at that or have a friend who's good at that, recording that can give you a lot of versatility. And then finally, there's also capturing local ambiances and species around. So if you can go out and field record, you can kind of get the sound of your own biome around you. And that can be really valuable if you're working with people who kind of want that palette. Okay, so we're going to go through some best practices for recording before we talk about what to do with your recorder. There's going to be 10 of them, and they're from Rick Veers, who I really admire and makes two great books. And the one this one is from the Sound Effects Bible. All right, so the first one is enabling pre-roll and post-roll. So in any recorder, whether this is a DAW like Pro Tools or Reaper, or an actual handheld recorder, you can give yourself a leeway of 2 to 5 seconds before and after you press record. The reason you want to do this is sometimes there's a sound going by and you just want to get out your recorder as soon as possible and make sure you don't miss it. And if you have pre-roll enabled, you will get more than you expected. The same as afterwards. Maybe you stopped too prematurely and there was a bit more material you wanted to get. Maybe the tail of the sound was longer than you expected and you didn't even realize. So having the pre-roll and post-roll enabled just gives you more flexibility and is a bit of a safety net on either side. The next is to record more than you need. So just like in film, they will record probably 10 times more than they're actually going to use in the final product. The same goes for us. So if we get way more than we need, we can select the best takes instead of settling for just what we have. And this just also gives you time to experiment with what you record and make sure what you have is actually usable and things like that. The next is to slate each take with a lot of info. So for most mics that we're going to talk about, you can verbally slate before or at the end of a take. So nice things to have are your name if there's multiple of you recording, the date, what you're recording especially, maybe what mic you're using, if it's in mono or stereo, etc. So you can log this if you can't verbally slate. We're going to talk about two mics, a contact mic and an EMF mic, where it's not going to pick up voice unless there's a very specific scenario where you may want to log this on a piece of paper or on your phone instead. But this saves you a lot of trouble since when you record quite a bit and it's very similar, you may not know what you're hearing. Slating can really help with that. The next one is to check levels often. So, unlike recording dialogue or live sound, you need to monitor your levels very often to prevent the recording from being too quiet or peaking. So, the problem with sounds being too quiet is that it actually causes noise in the signal. So, when it's so quiet, there's a hiss. That's usually because there's not enough signal coming into the mic and coming into the recorder. And then, of course, on the other end, there's peaking, also known as clipping, where it's kind of like overexposure in a camera. So that means that you're going to just lose that info if it peaks. Bringing the volume down is not going to help with how distorted the signal is. All right, the next one is to wear your headphones. So not everyone will do this, but I highly, highly recommend it. I think it's really important to listen to what you're recording while you record it. And otherwise, you're not going to know what if there's part of your signal chain that's flawed? What if there's a cable that's not working? What if it's, too loud? What if the background noise is so high and you didn't even realize that it's going to ruin your takes? Wearing headphones can help with this, of course. So there's a best practice, which is calibrating your headset. So what that means is a lot of recorders, especially DAWs, the Mix Pre 6, they have a test tone, which is a 1K tone. That's just a sine wave. And if you just keep this tone on, you'll hear it, and you want to kind of turn your headphone gain up until that sound is just a little bit irritating to your ears. Once it's a little bit irritating, that's usually the best volume to listen at. So that's what people mean when they say to calibrate your headset or to calibrate your speakers. This is also something you can do before any editing session in a DAW. And as far as which headphones to choose, you should choose over-ear headphones. So there's supranaural, the ones above where it's partially over your ears, and then full ones that are completely over your ears, which I personally think are the most comfortable. For all of these, you would want ones with a flat frequency response, which means that no frequencies are prioritized, like boosted or mitigated. So if you see bass boosting headphones, bass boosting speakers, that's not what we want. We want to make sure we're hearing the most accurate version of what's coming in as we can. All right, the next best practice is to eliminate background noise. So the first thing to do is do acoustic treatment in your space if this is something you want to do regularly. This is a whole field unto itself called acoustic engineering, so we're not going to go into it too much, but just know that there are some big offenders for creating background noise. There's your heater, AC, fridge, all things that can be turned off. If you don't want to turn your fridge off, you can just turn the knob up to a higher temperature so it doesn't work. Windows will introduce a lot of noise, as will doors being open, things like that. So if there's anything you can address in your space, even if you can't afford the panels and kind of things you see in this photo, having just a blackout curtain can help a lot with reducing noise. And having a door stopper also, if there's sound coming outside your door, can do a lot here. Another thing you can do is to choose the best mic placement. So if you have a directional microphone like this cardioid one or ones we'll talk about later, Where you choose to put the mic really matters. It really matters for what you're recording, but also what background noise you're picking up. So if you know your fridge is the biggest offender, make sure if it's a cardioid mic like this, that you're going away from the fridge with your mic, not towards. And lastly, location scout if you're field recording if you have that luxury. Sometimes you can look out and see a spot you want to record in and go in and test it first to know, is this actually viable? Some places look great on the map, but then you realize you're picking up the highway everywhere and it's not a consistent tone, so it's harder to denoise and maybe it's not the best place to be. Next is don't interrupt takes. This seems really intuitive, but can be really easy to do by mistake. So there are a couple different ways we can ride levels when we're recording. If you're turning the knob and turning the gain mid-take, that's what riding levels is. So what this does is change the level of background noise behind us mid-take, which is not conducive to clean recordings. We want a consistent background noise to make sure it doesn't interrupt. So the next part would be don't speak, of course, unless you're slating. Sometimes you forget to slate at the beginning. You can definitely slate at the end, but just do your best not to interrupt. And the easiest one to do is shuffling around, dinging your mic cable maybe into your own mic stand and things like that. So just before, see if there's, a mic cable that you have to address, or if your clothes, jewelry, things like that are causing problems. I highly recommend wearing just really comfortable fabrics that don't swish. Definitely no corduroys or anything like that. All right, almost done with the best practices for recording. So the next is to point the microphone at the sound. So you're going to want to know your mic's polar pattern, of course, and point your mic at the right material. So deciding what the right material is can be a creative decision sometimes. If there's a certain part of a door, let's say that you want to record, whether it's the hinge, the knob, opening, closing, maybe there's a hinge at the top too, you can kind of decide where to point the mic, either in advance or experiment and then try, but make sure it's at the sound you want. All right, checking equipment first. So something that will save you again and again is testing your equipment before you go out on the field or before you record. It's amazing how many times something doesn't work when it was working before, or maybe batteries were forgotten, things like that. But if you check before, you can address any issues before you get out there and can also avoid some disappointment. And finally, don't break any copyright laws. So if you're out in the field, you might be hearing licensed music in the background. This isn't the best place to record anyway, but make sure you don't record it in a take or to record something that was already created, like the Slack, something like that. That's already copyrighted, so recording that wouldn't really make sense. All right, so now we know best practices for recording. We're going to go into understanding our recorders. The first part is bit depth. There is a meme called WTF Are You Booming on Instagram that has a lot of jokes about mic placement, recording, things like that this picture is from. So for a 32-bit float, also 32-bit float, we'll get to that joke a bit later, but basically it's not a be-all, end-all kind of thing. And the mic itself doesn't have 32-bit float. So I have that there. But anyway, so the first thing we need to be concerned about is bit depth. Bit depth is the dynamic range of a sound, which is what is the difference between the lowest volume sound and the highest volume sound. So each bit is about 6 decibels of dynamic range, so it really makes a difference. Many games use 16-bit or 24-bit assets. So even if a game is going to use 16 bits, we still want to record at the highest fidelity we can. So we should be typically using either 24-bit or 32-bit float, depending on the circumstances. 32-bit float is a floating point system if you've never heard of it. So essentially, because it's a float and not an integer, there's more room before things peak, and you can technically record things that are quieter. So a lot of people have the misconception of we can set our recorders and forget it then because there's no peaking, but we still need a gain stage. We still need to make sure that we're recording at the right volume and generally avoiding peaking if we can, even with 32-bit float, is a best practice and just prevents more problems. But when we're recording, I'd say use 24-bit or 32-bit, especially if you're in an unpredictable setting. You don't know how loud things are going to get, things like that. The next is sample rate. So if bit depth has dynamic range, sample rate is the frequency response. It's the amount of samples taken per second, and that's why it's measured in hertz. So sample rate has to be at least double your bit depth. This is very important. If it's not double your bit depth, you will have distortion, artifacts, and other issues when you're recording that you can't take out. So the higher number means more processing can be done before getting artifacts. So if you know that there's a certain sound that you're going to capture that you want to process and process a lot, maybe you want to put the pitch down 2 octaves instead of 1, then a higher sample rate might be better. But because higher sample rates mean more data, more samples taken per second, that's going to mean it's a bigger file. So just if you do 192 kilohertz recordings, prepare for those to be very large. The mic I have in this sampler slide here is the Sanken, which you may have heard of, the 100K that can pick up a ton of stuff. It's an ultrasonic microphone. So it's stuff we can't even hear, basically. And when you process it, you can bring it down and actually hear the stuff that we can't perceive with our own ears. So it's a highly coveted mic, but it's very expensive. It's over 2K. Okay, so running power. There are a couple different ways depending on your recorder or your setup. So you're going to want to do the setup that's best for you. If you know you're going to be using a DAW, for example, which you can, of course, record from, then you're probably going to want an audio interface, and your power is basically going to be taken care of. It's going to be electronic, probably USB in your PC. If it's a field recorder like the Mix Pre 6 or the Tascam DR40 or the Zoom H4 or F3, any of those can take AA's or Lions. So one thing about AA's, there are some recorders, especially the smaller ones, where this works perfectly well and they'll last a while. But ones like Mix Pre's are going to eat those batteries. So if I put AA's in my Mix Pre 6, I have battery for 20 minutes. It was really disappointing the first time I figured that out. So Lion batteries, those big blocks, are typically a better solution if you're going with those. And the other power we want to talk about is phantom power. So phantom power is always going to be needed with condenser mics because they take voltage. They run a voltage. They need electricity. So make sure that if you do have them in, you turn on phantom power, but it's after they're already plugged in, and then you turn up the gain. Otherwise, you're going to ruin your mic a little early if it keeps getting all this power all of a sudden. All right. Final piece before we go to microphones. Some other best practices are formatting your memory card after each use, muting tracks that are not in use, since that can also introduce noise into our signal, choosing separate tracks in mix configuration, which means if you have the ability to say mix only for all the tracks or separate tracks, make sure you separate tracks, gain staging appropriately, and choosing mic level as the input signal, since that's the highest quality signal. For gain staging appropriately, what this means is going in the right order for setting gain and making sure the one at the very beginning, typically your hardware, has the highest gain in the chain. So just like setting sample rate at the wrong amount, like not twice the amount as bit depth, you will get a lot of distortion if the gain staging is not appropriate. If, let's say, the fader on one of those is turned to 60% and something earlier is 40%. So make sure the first way you can set gain is the highest. All right, so this is my favorite part. This is going to be understanding microphones and how they relate to game audio recording specifically to know which ones you want. So we're going to cover 6 today. We're going to cover condensers when they're in their shotgun shape. We're going to do condensers that have large diaphragms, condensers that are lavaliers, dynamic microphones, which I'm using here, contact mics, which can also be hydrophones, and EMF mics. All right, so the first is going to be those shotguns. So this is one of the most versatile mics in recording, especially for game audio, in my opinion. So they're great for recording a bunch of stuff, of course. I think high frequency sounds come out really well in these. Sounds captured indoors or outdoors, as long as you have the right equipment. And they're usually the mic that people use for Foley. So that's recording cloth, props, or footsteps in sync with picture, like what Molinaire does, or Formosa, or one of the big audio houses that can actually afford an in-house Foley artist, which is quite rare. So there are a couple common mics that you can buy or you're going to see around in here if you're shopping around. The first one is the Rode NTG5, or any of the Rode NTGs really, the Sennheiser MKH50, and the Sennheiser MKH416. So you can see different shapes here. They do have a bit of different uses. The Sennheiser MKH in the middle is what's called a pencil mic, is another term, and usually these are the best at catching the brightest tones, the highest frequencies, things like that. So if you were a musician, maybe you'd want to use it on a cymbal or something like that. Whereas the MKH416 is better at capturing things at a greater distance. So that 416 is probably going to be better outdoors because of how big its diaphragm is. It will pick up more of the room if it's indoors because of its length. All right, so I'm going to show you a sample of how I've used my NTG5 in a couple recordings for games. All right. Let's see here. So those are a couple examples. A lot of household objects are really good for recording with those. And basically, if you have a first mic, this tends to be a good one to choose. Okay. So it doesn't have to be the NTG5. It doesn't have to be one of these fancy mics. Condensers, electric condensers in particular, are also usually the onboard mics in field recorders. So if you just want to have built-in mics, field recorder, first time thing, that's what I had starting, and it worked perfectly well. So if you have this setup, just a couple things to keep in mind. You could have a lot of handling noise if you are just holding it and don't have a rig. I would recommend a small tripod or a pistol grip to make sure you have wind protection if you're out there. But technique is a lot more important than technology. The good recorders can still do plenty with those onboard mics. So if you have one of these, where do you put it? It's really important, as we saw earlier, of course. So usually, especially if you have the pencil mic, but this could also work for your field recorder, usually pointed down and diagonal at the source is best. That's going to give you the most space for the recording. I like to keep it at least 2 inches away from the source. This is because we're dealing with a directional mic, which means that the proximity effect happens if we get too close. What that is basically things are going to sound a lot bassier than they actually are. If we're recording and we want to use bassiness for sound design, we don't mind that it's in the take. Go ahead and do it. But to capture the most accurate version of a sound, I'd say keep it at least 2 inches away. And finally, avoid pointing it up. So the only reason we don't usually want to point the back of these at the ground is because it's a supercardioid polar pattern, which means it's picking up a little bit from the back as well as the front, even if it's not much. So if we're pointing it towards the ground, it could be picking up reflections from the ground, which we might not want in our recordings. So here's a couple other possible issues. I'll be giving you these slides so you can use these more as a reference We won't be diving into all of these now, but essentially, like we mentioned, just look out for the proximity effect, wind ruining your recordings, plosives, and mic stands being too cheap or unstable. So usually a stand with either a weighted back or a spherical base is sometimes better than the ones with three legs because sometimes they can get knocked over and stuff like that. And I think wind is going to be your biggest issue, especially if you're starting. So there are a couple accessories you can get to help with this. You can see on this little Tascam recorder what's called a wind muff, which can be used outdoors to protect the microphones. For the recordings with NTG5s, you might want a blimp. Blimps are generally used outdoors with that dead cat or dead wombat, a little furry base. And sometimes blimps are also used inside if you're worried about your microphone getting damaged. So if you're doing recordings of gore, which are usually a lot of vegetables, a lot of fruit getting sprayed everywhere, sometimes it's nice to have the blimp on. It will interfere with your recordings a little bit, but it's so marginal that it's more important to protect the mic. Then for plosives, you will want a pop filter. So that's the burst of air from hitting the mic from being too close. So pop filters can help with addressing those, whether it's voice or maybe you're hitting a cloth around, whooshing it. That's going to also hit the mic, cause plosives. All right, so now we're going to go on to large diaphragm condenser mics. These are going to be mainly indoor mics because they're so clunky and large. So they're great for a bunch of things. They're great for sharp transients, think impacts or drums. They're great for voiceover and creature sounds that you make with your voice. And they're good at picking up heavy, low-end sounds. So the mic examples in this section tend to be pricier than the rest. There are ones you can get that aren't as pricey. I'm not as familiar with them, but they are out there. So from left to right, 10 cents for your L22 is the first one. This one has mic emulation software, which essentially means that it has this technology where if you get the right audio interface and things like that, it can emulate the polar patterns and width of all these different microphones that are famous. The ones that you're going to see on the right aren't always used for game audio per se, but they just come up a lot, so I wanted to mention them. The U87 tends to be the voiceover mic to the point where some voice actors or singers have to have this mic to get hired. It's a bit strange, but it happens. And the Neumann C14 or 414 will also come up a lot. All right, so here's a couple examples of what you can use with a large diaphragm condenser mic. Let me know if there's any issues with the quality. All right. So what I used those for was also for Airborne Empire, like the first. But the reason I chose a large diaphragm condenser mic for the building materials was because I wanted the building placement sounds to feel heavy. They could be putting up an academy or a home or all these large objects. So for those larger buildings, we had that larger sound. So I figured Home Depot materials and things like that recorded with that mic would have the heft I was looking for as opposed to the NTG5. Whoop. Okay. So where do we put this mic? It's a bit different than the last one. There's a bunch of options. You could do upright, diagonal, or hanging down. If you're seeing singers like Frank Sinatra, photos of him, he's going to have the mic pointed upside down. But it's basically what's going to be most comfortable for you and for what you're recording. This also depends on your shock mount, which we'll get into in a moment. But no matter what, make sure the diaphragm is facing the source. Sometimes there are two diaphragms in these mics, but make sure it's the main one that's facing you, or just get one with one diaphragm to not have to worry about one that's kind of picking up the room and denoising, like with the Townsend Sphere mic. So one really important thing to consider with these is you're not just getting the mic in this sense, you're getting the whole rig. The mic has a lot of danger of falling down if you get a mic stand that's too light or a shock mount that's not screwed in appropriately. And then you could be killing a mic you invested a lot in. So I wanted to show a couple options depending on what you prefer that you can use. So getting the right shock mount for your mic, usually they'll rate which ones can go in. Another kind of perk of choosing more popular ones. We'll make sure that it screws in and isn't going to come apart when you turn it upside down or anything else. Otherwise, you can attach them to the desk if you want to use it mostly for recording around your desk or your own voice. That's what the mic boom arm here is. Or you can use a stand, and this part in the back is a weighted back. So essentially, even though the mic's heavy, it's not going to flip over. And I also recommend ones with wheels so that if there's different parts of the room you want to record in, you don't have to lug it all the way across, which can be a real pain and a bit of a hazard. So some of the issues overlap with the other condenser mic we talked about, that shotgun shape, or the field recorder ones, which is plosives, it falling down, proximity effect, and picking up too much of the room. So again, if you're hearing too much of your room, it probably does need to be acoustically treated. If there is a part that is causing more noise, make sure you point it away from that side. All right, so we're almost out of the condenser mic side. We're going to be discussing lavaliers, which usually have an omnidirectional polar pattern, which means it's picking up sound everywhere, but they're not always omnidirectional, so keep that in mind. I'm also going to be talking about them as a stereo pair, since I think that's generally best for outdoor ambiances, pass-bys. Then the exception would be mocap, where it's usually on the top of their head. All right, so there's a bunch of common mics that you're going to see sound designers talk about, especially game audio sound designers. The ones I hear about the most are the DPA 4060. Usually field recorders will go ahead and use these, but these are also often the mocap mics. There's the LOM basic UCOs, and I think they come in a pair. The UCs definitely come in a pair from LOM. Anything that's called UC is going to be a stereo pair where it's coming in. And then my personal favorite, the Clippy EM272s. So the Clippy EM272s are only, say, $50 compared to the rest of these guys and work very well. So I highly recommend that. All right, so the example I'm going to show here, I don't have the footage of me recording since recording out in the field would require another person recording me. But essentially, I went out when I used to live in Colorado and recorded crickets and a bunch of other things in that environment and just used it as a subtle ambience for this game. So we'll just listen to a bit of that here. So this is for a game called Letterhead, which was a word game that had very similar rules to Boggle that just was intended to be a very relaxing experience. So something like crickets worked really well. And so did recordings of a steel drum with my contact mic slowed down. But we could go into the contact mic in a bit. Oh, I also, let's see if this comes out for you guys, have the raw recording in case you're curious. Oh, there we go. So it's a bit quiet, but this is the raw recording I used in that take. All right, so I'm going to just discuss briefly why I think stereo is good for lavs, especially for ambiances compared to mono, and how that translates in game. So many sounds in games are 3D and better suited for mono because it's going to be a lot easier to place if it's mono than stereo. Stereo is usually intended for 2D tracks, so this could be the bass ambiance in something. It could be UI sounds, maybe, new game, save game, stuff like that. So it certainly has its uses, but usually 3D is better. However, I want you to consider how to record your sounds based on how they'll be implemented. If you think that you're only recording a sound that's going to be used for UI or for those ambiances, like going outside and recording birds or crickets like I did, then go ahead, definitely do stereo. But if not, maybe mono's better. Something like performing Foley, like those cloths, props, footsteps, that's almost always going to be recorded in mono because it's almost always going to be a 3D sound because it's usually following the character's actions. Okay, so where do we put these mics? So what you're typically going to see and what's the most stable is going to be on a bar with shock mount attachments for your mics. So you can use a pistol grip or a tripod underneath. So if you just want to stand these on the ground, tripod's great. But if you know you want to hold it, you just want 2 to 3 minutes of recording or a sample of an area, you can go ahead and keep it on a pistol grip. It's just going to kind of be hard to hold with a pistol grip because you're going to have to be stationary that whole time. So it depends how long you want to take in a certain area. The other places you can put mics, even though this is a bit more advanced and requires leaving your mics, is hiding them under leaves if they're really tiny, like the micro Uzis, or attaching them to tree trunks on either side if you're going to leave them for hours. One hazard of going outside, as you may have concluded by yourself, is dealing with rain. So there are a couple ways we can mitigate damage if our mics do get rained on or something happens. So what I recommend is using desiccant bags in plastic bags for each piece of the mic or your recording device that may have gotten damaged or may have gotten wet. So if you leave these sealed overnight, the silica gels or packs will kind of pull moisture out of them. If it got drenched, this isn't going to work, but if just a little bit got in, this might be able to save your microphones. Another way you can deal with rain is to put them in a secure case, especially if you're going in between, let's say, recording sites or sets or things like that. So a Pelican case or a Nana case are generally going to be waterproof, fireproof. They say shatterproof. I wouldn't personally test it. And those can also keep your mic safe. You can cut out different pieces, kind of like you can see on mine on the right, for the different mics, line batteries, headphones that you typically get with you so that nothing is as likely to be damaged. But this is most hazardous with rain or anything you're going to bring outside. Because we're outside, we're also going to be dealing with wind. So what wind protection you have is basically going to be dependent on what mics you have. So if it's those onboard field recorders, we're going to have those wind muffs like before. There's a wind jammer, which is the lav version of this that you can see on the right. Depending on what mic it is, especially LAMS mics, usually Rycote has their own blimps just for those that work. So the rig you see on the left is with the Zoom F3 and two basic UCOs. The Zoom F3 is a good secondary recorder, but it's so tiny and usually it's meant to be left that I wouldn't really recommend it as a first recorder. So we've talked about most of the possible issues here. But essentially, I think the hardest to start will be making a rig that works best for you. So if you have any questions about this, especially at the end, or you think of one tomorrow, feel free to email me and I can try to help you out. All right, so we're out of the cardioid section. We're going to briefly talk about dynamic mics before we go into the specialty mics. So dynamic mics, as you may recognize from the one I'm using here, are great for recording in a noisy environment, for loud source material, and risky sounds where the mic could break. So I won't have an example of these or footage I can show, but what I typically use them for is going to be just testing out a sound really quickly or testing out a creature sound, just something where I don't want to wait for the noise or the background noise to get better, just to say, does this work? Does this not work? So there's a couple of popular ones that you're going to see. The one I have is actually a staged mic. It's not as much meant for regular recording. It was the first mic I ever bought. And I had no idea these other ones existed, but it's been great for my voice. So the Shure SM7B and the Shure SM57 you will probably see everywhere. They're both really, really popular, especially for voice. And the Sennheiser 4212 is also going to be pretty prevalent. I think Sennheiser is a very reliable brand. I tend to recommend them, but if you want to go for any of these are at the very least the most popular ones you're going to see. So where do we put these? It's going to be a little bit different. So because dynamic mics work differently from condenser mics, we have a bit more to consider. The first is that the mic has to be right in front. So I don't know if you can hear me. Probably not anymore. They have to be really close for you to be able to make it intelligible. So if you're recording with these, make sure they're really close to the mic. Make sure what you're recording is also really close and that the gain is turned really high with these. So they don't require phantom power because they don't run on voltage, which means that we're going to need to run a lot of gain to them. We're going to have to make that channel almost as open as possible to be able to hear them. So if it's too quiet, make sure it's really close to you, that the gain is turned higher than you normally would. It would be even more than what's usually unity gain, like the highest gain you can have without distortion in your signal for a condenser mic. So there's a couple issues that come with these. The first is that recordings might sound dull. And what I mean by that is it picks up mid frequencies best. So if there are really bright high frequency tones like wind chimes, that's probably going to get lost in a mic like these. And the same goes for low end. If there's something that has really low frequencies, like maybe a dryer tumbling or an impact, the impact would be good if it's really loud. This has a higher dBSPL limit than most condenser mics, but otherwise it might sound a bit flat, so you kind of have to experiment. Being quiet is probably the biggest hazard, and then of course plosives, where make sure you can put a pop filter on, and that usually only works best with the mic stand, not a little small stand that I'm using here. But I would say if you have a really loud environment, you can't afford acoustic treatment, but you want to record and you want to start, this can be a bit of a way to skirt that because it picks up so little of the room around you. So it could be really loud here and you probably wouldn't know. And that's one of the best parts about it, I think. Okay, so we're going to go into the experimental mics next. There's just two of them here. While these aren't good for first recorders, these are really good for experimenting and just to see what you could do with sound design and get some unique material. So I highly recommend them for mechanisms and machines, for low-end thuds, impacts, and tones, and materials with high tension. And what I mean by that is something like a long rope or a long wire, a slinky, stuff like that, where you can stretch it out, impact it, and contact mic is great at picking that up. The reason is because it's only picking up vibrations through surfaces, not air, like these other mics. So because it can go through surfaces, some are waterproof, which is what makes them hydrophones also. They're not hydrophones if they're not waterproof. So keep that in mind. So here's a couple examples of what I've done with them for an impact in Airborne Empire. My thought behind this was we kind of wanted it to sound a bit dull and far away. There's not really any way for the camera to get close to this in an isometric view. So contact mics for this work best. Let's check it out. And that one doesn't have the full distance automation on it, so you could hear it a bit better, but it's even quieter, duller in game. So the most popular mics you'll see here, if you are interested, from left to right, are the LOM geophone. This is a hyper-specific one that only picks up low frequencies, earthquakes, things in the ground, stuff like that. So a lot of people, especially field recordists, will really enjoy using these. I think they are fun, but they're probably not the best first contact mic. The second is the Organic Audio's Kyocil. And this one is a hydrophone and a contact microphone in one. So if you want to see what it sounds like to record in a lake or your tub, and also want to record appliances around your home, this contact mic is a good one. Then the cheapest one, especially if you're crafty, is going to be the one on the right, which is a DIY piezo. So this will probably only cost you 10 to 20 bucks. And there are plenty of YouTube tutorials online if you just want to make one and say, hey, I want to experiment with this. So where to put the contact mic? This just depends on what you want to record, mainly. The biggest thing to look out for is that the contact mic cannot move in the middle of a take. If you move a contact mic in the middle of a take, it's really loud, it'll hurt your ears, and it will sound terrible. But it has a magnet on it, and you can also affix it to things pretty easily. So where to put it is basically what is going to actually make sound for you with this contact mic. Usually that's going to be things that have internal mechanisms, stuff that can rotate, stuff that moves inside or against a surface. And I'll show you a couple more examples here of what that could look like for you. I just broke my own rule. All right. So as you can see, feel free to experiment. Can't really go wrong. Just be careful of moving it in the middle of a take if it's unintentional. So what about the hydrophone component? What is that going to pick up? It's a bit trickier for putting it in water, but essentially, like with the ones on land, you want some sort of internal movement or things going on. So a carbonated beverage could be a good way to do this. Sucking water out of a straw could be a good way to do this. Or if it's in a tub, moving your hand around or putting something like a bath bomb in that's going to fizz and move. So that's kind of what I would recommend. I have a brief recording of me just putting this in seltzer as an example. So what are the issues we have? We know handling noise. Another one could be sudden peaking or thumping with movement of the mic. This is usually between takes. So if this happens to you, just turn your headphone gain lower than usual. I would say in general, it's best to have it maybe 5 decibels lower than usual because of how often this happens. And if water gets on the recorder by accident while you're recording your waterproof mic, your recorder still isn't waterproof, leave it without power to dry around desiccant bags, but generally just try to avoid it as best you can. All right, so the last mic we're going to discuss are EMF mics, which are the highest specialty. Not because they're difficult to use, but just because the use case is so restricted. So EMF stands for electromagnetic field, because that is what these are picking up. So anything that has an electrical current is probably going to have its own hidden sound that you were never even aware of. So it's great for recording anything electrical, household appliances, and your friends' gizmos. If you don't want to leave the house or you don't want to leave being indoors, this is a great one to have to discover what all is actually happening inside your electrical devices. It can be really good for sci-fi sounds, alarms, buzzing, anything with a lot of urgency. They're pretty grating sounds usually, not calming. So it's interesting to work with. So I made a free library of electromagnetic sounds a while back so you can kind of get a sense of what these mics can pick up. Warning, this might be a little loud. So, very specific use case. The most popular mics for these, and there's not many, are the Llama Electro UCs, so that's stereo pair again, and the Mic Booster Electro Pickup. The Mic Booster Electro Pickup is really cheap and works well. That's the one I have. It's, I think, only 20 euros. And it has a little suction at the end so it can stick to the devices you're recording, which I like. So where you put these depends on the source, but usually you either want to rest it on or hover above the source, depending on what sound it makes. You can move it around during the take. That could be how you can create a bit of variation in it. So experiment with placement. You can't really do any wrong. Just be warned that it's probably going to be loud like the contact mic and surprising. So something like an
Yeah.
Arduino board, things like that, I would hover above like here. Oops. Okay. So, possible issues. If you don't want to buy the LOM one, and it's hard to buy LOM ones because they're only available for a minute every couple months because they're so popular. You can buy the mic booster one. And if there's sudden peaking from how loud a part of the device is, turn your headphone gain lower than usual. This would be a pretty good use case for 32-bit float because you don't know what's going to happen while you're recording. So we have our mics, we have our recorders, we did our recording well, we followed the best practices. Doesn't matter unless we organize them properly. So basically, we need to edit them and categorize them so that the future versions of us can use them correctly. So what does this look like? We're going to briefly go into what you do after you record to make sure that you can make the most out of your recordings in the future. So what you can do in your DAW is use consistent naming conventions for all those recordings. If you have been verbally slating and have something to go off of or have been labeling them in your recorder, you are well ahead of the curve. So the universal category system is a pretty good option for file naming. That's what you'll see a lot in sound libraries when you buy them anyway. And if naming them is a pain, Aronson Dan made a UCS Reaper renaming tool that expedites this process. So I highly recommend it. The next would be to determine a file's possible uses. So how do we know if our recordings are useful? Well, think about what future use you could have for them. Is it something that's going to be a UI sound? Is it an ambience? Is it going to be just a transient that you're going to use in a larger impact or attack? That's going to be your guide for how you cut them up and how you label them, basically. So you'd add the UCS parent and child, like, electro miss or metal impact. Then determine if you want to cut it up in one shots or keep a continuous version. So impacts, maybe you can make a series, but usually you'll want a one shot of this. You also want to denoise if needed and trim out dead air to save on file size. If it's a noisy recording, denoising is going to be that step you need to take to make it useful, but ideally you'd get to a point where it's clean and you don't have to do this. So for cutting out dead air, there's a technique called strip silence that you could use. So strip silence is basically going to find that silence, and you could determine what silence is, if it's a threshold of minus 40 dB or minus 30, and cut those parts out all at once. It is efficient, but it doesn't work perfectly, so make sure it's not actually cutting out any tails or heads of the sounds that you're working with, especially if they start quiet or end quiet. You can do this in pretty much any DAW. The picture on the left is from Reaper, and the one on the right is from Pro Tools Strip Silence. So, after you've cut these up, after you've labeled them with UCS categories, denoise them, there's not much left. So for your folders, you just need to follow your naming conventions that you established, whether that's UCS or ones you created yourself. The parent folders can match the parent categories for UCS to make it easy to find in a pinch. Just make sure you do what's intuitive for you and that you can parse it easily. If you're following UCS, but you think your contact mic recordings should go in a different folder, because that's where you're going to look for them, do that. Basically, whatever's going to make this easier for you. For me, this all comes up in Reaper's Media Explorer. So the parent folders just make it easier to search, especially if I'm doing something less specific, more broad. But again, it may take some experimentation to figure out what's best. All right, so we are basically at the end here. I'm just going to give you a couple additional resources that you can use if you want to learn more about recording or universal category system or anything like that. There's a PDF I gave David, so you're also going to have links if you want to get to the renaming tool or anything like that, in addition to these books that I highly recommend. You can also reach out to me if you have questions, so that you can ask me questions in a minute at sabrinafedeleaudio@gmail.com or go to my website. All right. And that's what I have.